Drew Faust is here. In 2007, she became the first female president in Harvard University's 373-year history. She leads the school in one of its most challenging times in decades. The economic crisis shrank the university's endowment by 27%, a loss of about $11 billion in just 1 year. But the university is still the world's richest, and it is pushed ahead with major initiatives. It recently overhauled its undergraduate curriculum, made major investments in its science and engineering divisions, and broke ground on an ambitious expansion plan. Before Faust was named president, she was dean of the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard and a Civil War historian. She wrote on such topics as the role of women in the Confederacy and Southern nationalism. I'm pleased to have Drew Faust at this table for the first time, and this is her book, The Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War, continuing her scholarship about the Civil War, which we will talk about. What is it that you want to be part of your legacy?
I hope that my legacy will include a real commitment and expansion of access to Harvard education for undergraduates from every economic income bracket to graduate students who now often find themselves mired in considerable debt as they move through professional training. Harvard is an institution that depends on excellence, depends on attracting talent, and we must make sure that as we move through the 21st century that we get the very best students as we seek to educate them for the world.
Is anything different about the job than you expected?
Well, losing, as you said, $11 billion of the endowment was certainly a surprise in the sense that it was not, of course, anything anyone predicted, and it does change our circumstances in significant ways that we have to adjust to and plan for because we want to make sure we do what's important for us in teaching and research.
So what are you going to change because of the dramatic drop in your endowment?
Well, one of the things that we are looking hard at is the pace of our expansion in Alston, and we will undertake that future a little bit more slowly than we would have had circumstances not changed. We also made a number of adjustments in the course of the last calendar year as we saw the changing economic circumstances. That included looking very hard at the size of our staff, looking very hard at the program expansions that we had undertaken in recent years. We created new centers. How do we fund those? How do we move those forward? And we're continuing to look at a variety of issues of things that have just grown up over time. Are they structured in the right way? Harvard has 72 libraries. Do we need all 72 in exactly the form in which they are currently configured? Are there savings we can garner from consolidating, from working more closely together in more efficient ways? So questions like that.
People who went to Harvard in the 60s and 70s, how is that Harvard different from today's Harvard? Class size, curriculum, use of technology?
In the 1960s and 70s?
Yeah.
You're speaking to a historian, so I have to make sure I've got the right century here. Okay, 1960s and 70s. Let me tell you one thing about that Harvard that is very meaningful to me. Had I been an undergraduate at Radcliffe College, I would not have been allowed in the undergraduate library until the spring of my junior year, which would have been 1967.
In 1964, you were a Radcliffe student. You couldn't go to the Harvard Library.
To the undergraduate library. Yeah. It was only for men. So the place of men and women...
Seems like a long, long time ago, doesn't it? That those kind of things existed.
It does. But men and women at Harvard were...
It's only 40 years.
...very differentially treated in those days. And Radcliffe was much smaller than Harvard, so that there were 4 times as many men as women. The diversity of the population overall, the student population, would have been far less than it is now in terms of ethnicity, in terms of international presence, and certainly in terms of economic circumstance. So that would have been one key difference. I think fields would have been different. We have so much interdisciplinary work now. The faculty would have been different.
Right. But how about this? The simple process of someone teaching someone else and someone learning from someone else has the dynamic of that thing that has been the engine of becoming an educated person changed?
Both yes and no. the key interaction where minds spark one another and create more than any individual person could imagine for him or herself. That has not changed. But there's so many techniques of getting to that end that have changed. Technology, obviously, has been transformative.
Access to information.
Everybody has access to information. Everybody has a PC. Everybody can get onto the internet. We can have classes where we have information about Africa, for example, and we can superimpose every map that has ever existed of Africa to show where the slave trade was combined with where a certain production of crops was. We can show population changes. We can use Google Earth to zoom in and see what it looks like. Bringing things like that into a classroom.
Is that making us a smarter society?
Well, it depends how you define smarter society.
Wiser?
We have more information, but do we succeed in turning that into knowledge and, as you say, wisdom? Those things are not necessarily always exactly correlated with one another. What do we do with all this information?
Yeah, tell me.
Well, I think so much of teaching now and education now is less about accumulating information, because it's not hard to learn to do that. You need sometimes maps and guides from librarians or other kinds of databases to help you through the information, but we can all get more information than we know what to do with. We have to learn to judge its reliability. We have to challenge its logic. We have to know the questions that we don't have the information to answer and know our shortcomings, so be aware of what we still need to find out about. And that's what happens in that interaction that I think is magical between a teacher and a student, or a student and another student as well.
Have we learned how to judge teachers, is my question.
That is a critical question for us. We certainly spend a lot more time doing it now than we did in the 1960s. To go back to your earlier question, what has changed? One thing that's changed a lot is how much we care about teaching and how we try to support teaching, improve teaching, and assess teaching. Every course in Harvard's undergraduate curriculum is evaluated by the students. There is a form at the end of the semester that the student fills out. So that information is available to the professor, to other students who might want to know, do they want to take this course? Is this a good professor? But what an evaluation like that doesn't tell us is the knowledge that is required to take the next step in that field been adequately presented? Does this course leave an impression with a student a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later? Would someone who's expert in that field attending that class think that the material has been covered in an adequate way? So there are many other kinds of evaluations that teaching should have as well.
Somebody comes up to you this fall and says, Madam President, I'm so happy to be here. Student at Harvard University, one of the great universities in the world. What do you want me to be? What do you want me to get out of this? What kind of person should I become in the next 4 years?
I love that question because I think about it every fall when I address the freshman class as they've just arrived on campus. And one of the things I remind them of is that they have chosen to come to Harvard. And Harvard is a research university, which means several things. It means it's a very large place. It's as big as Yale and Princeton and Amherst combined. And that means it has all kinds of facets that they might not be aware of right away. So I tell them to be adventurers, to go out and find Emily Dickinson's original manuscripts in the Houghton Library, to go over to the School of Public Health and find out what someone's doing in terms of research on global health, to explore the variety of extracurricular activities, to go learn to row on the Charles River, do things that are outside their comfort zone. That's why they came to this institution. Then there's another part of being a research university, which is the research part. They are in an institution in which full tenure on the faculty requires proof that you are on the cutting edge of discovery in your field. So students ought to make themselves part of that process of discovery. Don't just settle for people giving you knowledge they already have. Instead, get a job as an assistant in a laboratory.
Find out where the cutting edge is.
Yeah, find where the cutting edge is and make yourself part of that.
And how does one divide, in terms of a university, its responsibility to the teaching process and its responsibility to the furtherance of knowledge process?
That is always a dynamic and important tension in a research university. because faculty find themselves torn in two ways. Increasingly, they are supported and encouraged and dedicated to teaching. That's something that's really changed over the past several decades, as I mentioned before.
More dedicated to teaching?
To teaching. But they're also defined by their research achievements. And so they move back and forth one to the other. But what we believe as an institution and what our faculty find is that each is enriched by the other. You are a better teacher because you are discovering things about your field all the time.
So the loss of the endowment, how long will it take you to recover from that?
Depends on the markets. I mean, we can plot out, if you mean when we get back to the size or...
Yes. I mean, it wasn't even close. Harvard's endowment was so much larger than everybody else. It was like a different world.
It's true. We have the largest endowment. We still have the largest endowment. Essentially, the size of our endowment now is about where it was in 2005.
Will it take you a number of years to get back to that?
Well, it depends on how well our investments perform. But we think that it will take us a considerable amount of time.
Is there any debate about how you compensate the people who serve as your investment?
Yes. Yes.
And where are you on that?
That's been a matter of considerable debate.
Yes.
We have an organization called Harvard Management Company that manages the endowment for Harvard.
And they did really well for...
They did extremely well over the last 10 years, including the year that just passed, the very difficult year. If you average our return, it's been 8.9%.
Isn't it run by a woman, isn't it?
It's run by a woman named Jane Mendillo.
Right.
And what we found is, according to law, we have to reveal the compensation that we pay to our internal managers. Many universities have external management of their endowments, so they don't have to reveal the cost of that management. But we find that if we compare the funds we manage externally with the ones we manage internally, it is much more efficient and much less costly to manage them internally. So what we are revealing is something that has drawn criticism, because these are people in financial services and they're extremely well compensated, so that we can be competitive in attracting them from other kinds of opportunities in financial services. But even taking those considerable rewards for those individuals into account, we are very much more cost-conscious and cost-effective by managing internally and revealing those costs than those who manage externally.
You sound like somebody who's pretty good at this management game.
Hope so.
I mean, you could run General Motors, couldn't you?
Oh, sure.
There you go. You could. Would you want to?
Would I want to? I prefer to run Harvard.
This, before I talk about the Civil War, 18 of the top 20 great universities are in the United States. True. Are the other two, Cambridge and Oxford, or where are they?
I'm not sure which list you're referring to.
Well, you help me. But
certainly Cambridge and Oxford are great universities. I think Chinese universities are rising in prominence.
And not only are they rising, it is a national policy to have more on the list.
And they're working very hard to invest and to bring more students into university life. And indeed, when I was at China a year ago, there was a lot of interest in the model that is not vocational but includes humanities, includes liberal arts, a lot of questions to me about how that operated in the United States. So I think a real eye on the elite institutions in the United States.
How do we stack up?
How do we as a nation stack up?
Here's the conventional wisdom. Well, that's in a minute, but here's conventional wisdom. America has great universities. It's failing badly in terms of the public education of K through 12.
Well, let me say what I thought you were going to say.
Which would probably be better.
No. And then let me respond to what you actually said. When you were saying it's failing, I thought you were going to talk about how we're not supporting our great public institutions of higher education.
Higher education? You mean like University of North Carolina, University of California?
University of California right now is facing extraordinary budget cuts and
because
pressures.
California's going through extraordinary budget
And the strength of American higher education is its variety. It's having public institutions like Berkeley that are fabulously strong, having institutions like Harvard that are different, having small colleges like Amherst and Williams that are different still. And so what I heard you say, and then it wasn't what you said, and I'll respond to what you just said, is something that I think is very important, that the kinds of competition that you're referring to among nations, we have been outstanding in that in the United States because of the the variety of institutions. And so what's at risk in the United States now with the changing financial pressures is our ability to sustain that variety of institutions in all their strength. Now, your other question, your real question, was about how can universities be great?
I'll take credit for both of them.
Okay. How can universities be great if what precedes them is not?
Right.
And that's something that concerns us a great deal. And it concerns us partly because we have a graduate school of education that is dedicated to trying to solve this dilemma in the United States and beyond. But it concerns us also because our ability to attract students and open access to people of talent is, of course, dependent on the opportunities available to those students before they come to us. Our Graduate School of Education has just created a new education leadership degree, which is designed to help address some of these problems in K-12 education. And the concept behind this degree is that people in education need to understand learning and teaching and how students do both those, how they learn and how teachers teach. But they also need to understand education policy, and they need to understand management and leadership in order to run school systems that can deliver what is known about teaching and learning. And so this degree is meant to combine management, policy, and understanding of learning. And I think that's an important insight. How do our schools fail? They fail in part because we don't attract enough terrifically talented people to education, we don't support them well enough, and we don't throw our premier managerial and leadership talents into education. And it's my hope that many more Harvard students will become teachers.
Universities today and cultural institutions today are international institutions, both in terms of where their tentacles reach and also where their students come from and their faculty.
That's very much the case. Our freshman class this year, our entering class, has 10% of the entering class has non-U.S. passports only. And then another 12% are either permanent residents of the United States or hold dual passports, U.S. and something else. And then that leaves 78% of the class remains after the numbers I just said. Of that 78%, another 20% speak a language other than English in addition to English at home. So this is a United Nations of origins and language groups and national identities.
Now the question of the United States in terms of not only our institutions but our national leadership, our national place in the world. What worries you about us in this country being able to maximize its potential, maintain its place, do what it ought to do with the resources it has had in science, in technology, in innovation, in creativity, in human resources?
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about a moment ago. What is the future for higher education in the United States and for the research enterprise in the United States? Let me say something specifically about science in this regard. In the aftermath of World War II, there emerged a kind of alliance between the federal government and U.S. universities that determined that the site of scientific research in the United States was going to be universities. It wasn't going to be separate research centers. This was a very important decision because it meant teaching and research and young scholars and accomplished scientists would all be undertaking this work together. But we've come to a point, we had come to a point by the end of the 20th century and in the first few years of the 21st where federal funding for science was flat or declining. Many young scientists were finding their way into those career-launching grants blocked by a pipeline of waiting grants that all had been deemed as worthy, exciting, and yet could not be funded. And so we were attracting people into science, and then we were kind of letting them hang there. It got so that the age of the first receipt of these life-changing, career-changing grants was 43 years old before you really got a sense that you were going to make it in this scientific career. So we were losing talent. We were bleeding talent out of science. Now, at the same time all that's happening, we have places
in other places
like
there was a huge emphasis on science.
China, Singapore,
right.
investing heavily,
India, yeah.
attracting scientists away from us to activities in those countries. We now have the stimulus, which is funding science very generously for the next 2 years. I and other university presidents worry a lot about what happens at the end of that cliff. Is science funding going to be sustained, extended, or do we find that national deficits challenge, undermine the ability of the federal government to continue that critical investment in America's future and the future of discovery?
Another Harvard man was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who worried about dumbing down the culture. Do you worry about that?
I think I'd want to know, what does dumbing down the culture mean?
Lowest common denominator on
one
everything.
thing I worry about is extended.
Elitism.
Well, I worry about attention span. Because people will not listen to more than a couple of sentences or read more than a couple of sentences. Does everything have to be a soundbite? Is everything to be digested into something brief? And aren't there complicated ideas that we ought to have the patience to give our attention to? So I think I worry about dumbing down in terms of speed and in terms of reflection. Do we sit back and think about things hard, or do we always have to go on to the next soundbite, the next stimulus?
I worry about that too. The Civil War. How many books have you written about the Civil War?
Well, I've written
I'll help
6
you.
books. I've written 6 books, and the first one really didn't make it to the Civil War. It was about pre-Civil War South.
Yeah.
The next one was a biography, and the individual I wrote about died during the Civil War, but most of the book wasn't about him.
So what is it about the Civil War?
Why did I get so interested in the Civil War? Well, it almost was overdetermined. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley.
Oh, yes.
I played Civil War as a child.
Yeah.
My brother made me be Grant because he had to be Lee.
Yes.
And it took me a long time to realize that I actually won. He didn't tell me that part.
Yes.
We used to visit Civil War battlefields on weekends as a family. You must have had all of this growing up in North Carolina.
Exactly, not very far from.
And then I think I got interested in it as an academic subject, in part because of the intensity of the experience. What historians look for is change. How do people change over time? And the Civil War made people change in a very short amount of time because of the pressures that it imposed on them. And so there's something of the moment of truth aspect to studying war that is a very attractive subject.
This Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War is Drew Gilpin Faust, the president of Harvard's maybe last for a while book on the Civil War.
Just say for a while.
For a while. I thank you for coming.